Well, you hear that? Without the syncopation. It's a march. And it's the da-da, da-da. It's almost like there are two notes, da-da, where the first note is very quick, and the second one is held longer. Short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. Are you with me? That's it. That's what makes up ragtime, really, are those two notes that are syncopated. Are you with me? And that's what happens on the piano when pianists start to play ragtime music. And Scott Joplin wrote a lot of ragtime pieces. But he was also classically trained. He went to college and got some training in the Midwest. And he wrote 2 operas. One opera did not survive, so we have no idea what it sounded like. But there's another opera, and it's called Treemonisha. And that's the opera that's on the top of your first page of your handout. Do you remember when we talked about George Gershwin? And we said that George Gershwin first made his career as a Broadway musical composer, but he wanted what we might call legitimacy in the eyes of all of the public, including the highbrow society. That Gershwin wanted to be accepted by those who thought classical music was a higher art form than popular music. Remember we mentioned that? Gershwin wrote Broadway stuff, but he also wrote these so-called classical pieces with jazz and blues because he wanted, in part, to be accepted by the world of the society that thought that classical music was the only way to go. George Gershwin wanted legitimacy. He wanted to be accepted with that group. Scott Joplin, as an African-American composer, wanted the same. He wanted legitimacy. And he wanted to write operas. One opera survived, and that's called Treemonisha, and he wrote it all the way in 1907. But here's the deal. Ragtime music, piano music, started out as up and down the Mississippi River Valley, where pianists just played in often loud bars or what have you, and played very loudly and often very fast. And that's what ragtime was, initially. But Joplin wanted to legitimize ragtime. He wanted it to be put on a pedestal as an art form. The same way composers in the past, like Frédéric Chopin, a so-called classical composer in the 19th century, wanted to put the waltz on a pedestal. It was a dance people danced to, but he wanted to pay homage to the waltz. So Chopin wrote a lot of waltzes. They're too fast for dancing. They weren't intended to be danced to. But they were waltzes that he was paying dedication to by composing waltzes. Joplin wanted the same thing for ragtime. So he told people that they shouldn't play these ragtime pieces that he wrote too fast, and he wanted to write a ragtime opera to legitimize ragtime. Does that make sense? He was obsessed with wanting to write a ragtime opera. He wrote one, he nagged his publisher for years to publish it, and eventually he bankrupted himself by hiring people to act out these operas in front of an audience. Are you with me, Carl? So he put on a dress rehearsal, for example, in a large dance hall in St. Louis. Supposedly it was well received, this one opera that was called A Guest of Honor. We don't know what it sounds like. It's lost. But he couldn't get it properly produced or published. The opera was never heard of again. And it was eventually lost. We have no idea what it sounded like. Scott Joplin's wife, his widow, suspected that a lot of the manuscripts of his writing down these operas in music notation might have been in a trunk full of letters, family photographs, and music and clothing that Joplin left as collateral for an unpaid rooming house bill. But he still wanted to write an opera. So he eventually moved to New York in Harlem, and this is the time of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of great writers, a lot of great composers and great artists and what have you were living in Harlem and creating all kinds of artistic works. And Scott Joplin was one of these persons. And that's where he wrote Treemonisha. He realized that he needed to have it orchestrated, meaning opera is usually accompanied by an orchestra. And he knew that in order to have a full production, he needed to have an orchestra. So he employed a young ragtime musician to help him copy the parts of the orchestral parts that he wrote, and it became an obsession for him. His teaching began to suffer, and he finally finished it, but he still couldn't get New York managers to put on the opera. So he put on a performance with himself playing the piano in a really lousy hall in Harlem with a largely invited audience. Someone who saw that work there said this, quote, "Without scenery, costumes, lighting, or orchestral backing, the drama seemed thin and unconvincing. It was almost like a rehearsal." And part of the problem with regards to his African-American colleagues was that his opera was a ragtime opera. And often intellectuals and great artists and musicians in Harlem, as part of the Harlem Renaissance, also thought that it was lowly to write works that had popular idioms in it, like ragtime. So the most African-American composers and writers and intellectuals in Harlem thought classical music is the finer road and popular music is lowering oneself. And so he didn't get support within the Harlem community either very much. And hardly anyone got to see that dismal performance, and Joplin was pretty heartbroken, and this helped to bring on his death. He had advancing syphilis, and his mind went, as did his physical coordination. He was finally taken to Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island. He died in 1917. But here's the kind of good news. 50 years later, in the 1960s, way after he died, a musicologist discovered some of his piano music. And he persuaded a recording company, this musicologist, to let him record Scott Joplin's piano works. And then a film director who was directing Robert Redford and Paul Newman, famous actors, in a film called The Sting, put arrangements of this ragtime that they heard from the recording. They put it into the movie, and the movie wound up winning Best Film of the Year. All of a sudden, from then on, everybody practically knew of Scott Joplin, who he was, and his music, like the piece you just heard. And that came out in 1974, the movie. And the soundtrack sold over 2 million copies in records and tapes. Now, all of a sudden, 60 years after his death, Joplin is famous in America. And in 1972, they also had the world premiere of Treemonisha with an orchestra backing it up in Atlanta and then outside of Washington, D.C. And then finally the Houston Grand Opera did a big production. It received excellent reviews. It opened on Broadway in that same year. So 64 years after Joplin writes this, his dream is finally recognized. Joplin was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1976 for this work called Treemonisha. And this work had recitatives, arias, ensemble work, duets. There was also dance, choreography to much of the ragtime music. Some of the music sounds like traditional operatic writing. Some of it sounds like ragtime. Some of it sounds like a form of music that was popular around the time that he wrote this, called barbershop quartet music, where 4 male singers are harmonizing a cappella. Everybody know what a cappella means? Well, without instruments accompanying the singers. Yeah, because the singers are singing music. And so there's a lot of different things in this opera. I think you're going to be surprised to hear the variety in this very early opera of 1907. Now, the work masqueraded as a folk fable, but it had a social message. That education was the road to salvation for black liberation. He was ahead of his time. It was also a little bit of women's liberation, because the main character of the opera was an 18-year-old heroine, because she had an education and became the leader of her people. So ragtime, which was once degraded by middle-class European American community, has now been canonized. Let's go ahead and turn to the first page. Let's talk about the plot. Actually, it's on the reverse side of the first page. Someone want to read the opening paragraph, background for the opera? And this paragraph, by the way, is information that you'll find out before you start watching the opera or listening to it. So who wants to read the first paragraph? Volunteers? Oh?
The opera begins in Arkansas just after the Civil War among a group of ex-slave families who are living in a poor community. One couple, Ned and Monisha, are superstitious and believe in conjuring, as does everyone else in the community. One morning, Monisha finds a baby under a tree. They raise the baby, telling the community it is their baby. Monisha arranges to work for a white family if the family agrees to educate the growing child. This is what takes place. The child is always found playing under the tree where she was originally found, so she is called Treemonisha.
That's where we get the name. It's her name. Someone else want to read the plot when the opera begins? Yeah.
Treemonisha criticizes dishonest conjurers trying to sell items to poor people in the community. Conjurers feel that she will endanger their livelihood, so they kidnap her and are about to throw her into a hive of wasps, but she is rescued by the community first. The community is ready to punish the kidnappers, but Treemonisha insists that they should be forgiven, and she is fairly scolded. All eventually rejoice.
All eventually rejoice. So this one does have a bit of a happy ending. This one doesn't have a tragic ending. Who wants to read the subplot? Okay, go for it.
Treemonisha always thought that she was the natural-born child of Ned and Monisha until the middle of the opera when they tell her the truth.
So why don't we start today's opera by listening to one piece, and then we'll continue a week from today. Just a reminder, next Tuesday, as I'm sure you know, is fall break, so don't come to class because you're going to be terribly alone and it'll be dark and neither will everyone else. So just keep that in mind. So this first example is a ragtime sounding piece, and you have the words on the front side of the second page. It's called We're Going Around. And by the way, when you see words to opera and you see a bracket, that means that those words are being sung by different people at the same time. So let's go ahead and play this one piece. It's only 2 minutes long. And we'll end for today.